Okay. All right. On this session, we have two resource speaker, and I would like to introduce the first speaker, and the second speaker will be introduced by Jolie. Jolie Honey has worked in mathematics education for 30 years. She is an author, professional learning consultant, and serves on the executive board of Conference Board of Mathematical Sciences and the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, NCTM, in 2003 to 2026. Jolie has been a classroom teacher, a district academic math coach specialist, district PK to 12 math supervisor, and has served as a STEM mathematics coordinator and as a mathematics equity specialist at Utah State Board of Education. She is past president of the Association of State Supervisor of Mathematics, ASSM, and the Utah Council of Teachers of Mathematics, UCTM. Jolie has worked closely with colleagues over the years to promote learning and teaching of all students, with a focus on students' achievement, teacher retention and empowerment, and inclusion for students with special needs. She has presented nationally on this topic at ASSM, MCTM, NCSM, and special education conferences, and ASDE and CSI. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to welcome Jolie and Mike, and I'd like to let Jolie introduce Mike as a co-presenter. And Jolie, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike. And there's going to be a lot of mics, it sounds like, and that'll be just great. I am Jolie Honey, and I know when they asked to submit a bio, I didn't realize that would be read. I probably would have kept it a lot shorter and definitely with fewer acronyms, with all of the acronyms that we already have in education. But I'm also very, very excited to have Mike Steele with me. I am actually, do you know, speaking of bios, I adore Mike and have admired Mike Steele from afar for a number of years with his work with 5 practices for orchestrating productive discussions, the 5 practices in practice. Mike also has served as the president of the Association of Math Teacher Educators. In Nevada, you probably have a Nevada Association of Math Teacher Educators as well. And I met Mike probably 4 or 5 years ago through some mutual work that we've done. And we're really excited today to share with you the work that we've been doing on strengths-based or more broadly asset-based learning environments. And our focus today is, in fact, Mike, I would love for you to just take a moment just to share a couple of more things. I learn so much from Mike all the time. A couple of more things while I go ahead and get the slide deck going, if you don't mind.
That's beautiful. Good morning, everybody, to where most of you are. Good afternoon for me. I'm here on the beautiful campus of University of Toledo, which is actually enemy territory for me since I'm a professor at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. But it's family weekend at University of Toledo where our daughter goes. So I'm taking a moment out from that to hang out with all of you for an hour. But as Julie said, I'm a past president of the Association of Mathematics Teacher Educators. And Julie and I are going to be colleagues on the NCTM board starting in just a few short weeks for the next 3 years. And I've been a huge fan of Jolie's work, in particular with ASSM, which is the first context in which we met. And it's been a pleasure for us to come together and do this work. I've been a professor and researcher in mathematics education. Started my career as a middle school and high school math teacher just a little over 20 years ago. And my focus is on thinking about mathematics teacher cognition, mathematics teacher learning, and effective pedagogical practices. I had the privilege of being a co-author for NCTM's Taking Action series, which talks about the 8 effective mathematics teaching practices, and on some of the 5 practices work, but we'll talk about that a little bit further down the line. So I see the slides are up. So without further ado, I'm going to toss it back to Jolie so she can get us started.
Awesome, great. And so everyone, our session this morning is really going to together talk about how asset-based language empowers students and also supports productive beliefs. It will also discuss which asset-based routines impact student identity and agency, and then also how social emotional learning aligns directly with the conversation we're talking about in our mathematics classroom. I also want to share with you that as we focus on asset-based language and asset-based routines, all of our conversation will be focused on how these actions support student identity and agency and authority. So our success criteria is that we'll also make connections to our own experiences. We're really going to ask you guys to hang out in the chat box. I already love that some people were doing that, so thank you so much. And how having language and routines for this experience you can try in your classroom immediately. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to focus on our conversation around asset-based language. And so I'd like for everyone to just look at this pattern and think about, what do you notice? And we're going to do something called a waterfall in the chat box. I'd love for you to go ahead and in the chat box, what do you notice about this pattern that you see in front of you? But don't hit enter yet. So just kind of type in what you're noticing. We're going to all hit enter at the same time, but give everyone a chance to pay attention. It's like, what are you noticing about the pattern that is in front of you? And awesome. If you'll please hit enter, we're going to notice lots of interesting things that we're seeing, things are shorter to taller, increasing by 2 each time. It looks like a staircase. And so I'm going to read a couple of more things. And while I'm noticing a couple of things that people were noticing, I want you to also be like, what do you wonder? So in our next slide is, what do you wonder? And awesome. And we're going to do the waterfall again. So if you'll just kind of, I like the gradual growth. We're seeing the numbers 1 through 4 at the bottom. And I really love how you were like, these are the things that I'm noticing. The pattern is increasing. What a beautiful word. And now go ahead and hit enter. And I love this. I wonder why they are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you guys, yeah, go ahead and hit enter. And awesome, that like what this is a graph of some sort. What's the representation? I wonder what the boxes represent. I wonder why it starts with 3 blocks. I wonder if it has no end. What is 0? I wonder what model goes with this. And perfect. These are wonderful things to wonder about. And so I'm going to start by sharing with you, and some of you may have noticed that there is a little mathematics vision project icon, because the content that we are currently discussing does come from mathematics vision project, or in other words, open up resources. However, this would be for any task. So even though we're going to focus on this particular task, we're just wanting to give credit for where that comes from. So this particular situation does model, and I did even see someone in the chat box say it looks like an arithmetic sequence. So we'll talk about that a little bit too, or I wonder if this represents an arithmetic sequence. So kind of even wondering, is this information discrete or is it continuous? So is something happening at 1.3 or not? And so when adding context, it really helps us to make more sense of what's happening. And this situation is Scott, who is going to be doing a workout program. And on day 1, he begins his exercise routine by doing 3 push-ups. And then the next day, he does the number of push-ups you see, which many people notice that 3 was there, and then he's done 2 more push-ups, and then we see the adding 2 each day. So Scott's kind of like, after 4 days, he's certain he can continue this pattern of increasing the number of push-ups he completes each day, which I think takes to someone else's wondering of how long can this pattern continue, or can it go on forever? So what I'd like for you guys to do is just think about this for just a couple of moments. If you have some scratch paper around, just kind of think about other representations that you would do with this. So right now we're seeing we call this a geometric model or a concrete model, but please go ahead and write, if you wanted to do a table of values, or if you wanted to sketch a graph, do both. If there's an equation that comes to mind that would be valuable for doing this work, that would also be awesome. And I do want to give everyone just a moment to be able to think about that. So by the way, and a little bit later, we're going to talk about the 5 practices a bit more. I know we mentioned that, but one of the things that we do with tasks that we talk about is having asset bases that we always anticipate different ways students are going to think about problems. And that's actually what I'm asking us to do right now is think about, if a student was creating a table, what would be in that table if they were doing a graph. So we want to think about possibilities that students would have. We also want to think about different solutions that they would come up with, ways of making connections. And then also, like, are there any potential misconceptions, if you will? And since the beginning of this session is focusing on asset-based language, I'm going to show you the next screen, which I'm hoping you've had some time to think about and work on this. And I'd like for you to, one more time in the chat box, but again, we're going to waterfall this one too. We're not going to keep doing waterfalls, but in this case, I still want everyone to have time to think about this. I'd like for you to think about if you were walking around the room after we launched the task where we shared the situation with Scott's workout and asked people to use different representations. If you were walking around the room, I'd like for you to think about what strengths do we see students using that we could use? And I just realized that I have birds in the background. Sorry about that. But what strengths are you seeing from the student work in front of us that you could use to move the work forward for all students? So if you walked around a room and you asked a student, tell me more about what you're doing here, explain your thinking and what's happening. What could you use from the student work that we see here that could move the learning forward for the whole class? And if we can go ahead, and I'm seeing some things that were in the chat box while I was talking now. And Mike, I just realized that was you. If Scott were me, we wouldn't make it much past day 5. But everyone, I appreciate what you put in the chat box. If you'll please go ahead and hit enter. Thank you. Thanks, Lori. Thanks, team. Nice. Looking at that pattern and seeing that pattern. I love the person who said color coding. I like having students share who have used some color so that it encourages other students to share in the future with color that's being used. Something about a student doing something that really has their peers think, oh, that's a great idea. Let me do that in the future, versus me as the teacher saying, and everyone grab your colored pencils and go to town. Really like that. And it's like, and asking the students if they can explain it using pictures. And I love this. The person who says my students are deaf, color really helps. I also spend a lot of time working with students with disabilities, and I say high incidence disabilities, which I know is different than students being deaf, but the power of using patterns to make sense of mathematics is really super supportive of so many different groups of students. So thank you so much. I really appreciate the comments that are here. I think this is, how can we create an equation? I think that whole, the +2 in the table was mentioned. So I do want to just share that absolutely, when we're looking at this, having students understand and recognize that +2 and how you can see that in the table. I would have the student who perhaps showed their work on the left where they're seeing that +2. I would ask students in the classroom if they can compare and connect the two different representations and where do they see that +2 showing up in the table versus the graph, and how do those two things connect. I also really appreciate this work in showing that that +2 in the table is written and you can see where the +2 is happening repeatedly, but also the +2 that the person happens to see in this graph. And also highlighting that these things are connective to thinking about things recursively, which happens to be one of the takeaways in this task. So I want to share with you also that when we do these tasks, one of the best ways, so as a tip, one of the best ways to highlight what students are doing that is accurate or appropriate is to make sure we know the takeaways or the goals of the lesson. So we really are honing in on how arithmetic sequences have that constant difference. In this case, that +2 that's happening. And then we saw that both in the table and in the geometric model. We also want students to generate multiple representations. And we also wanted them to see things both recursively and explicitly. We'll look at more student work in a bit, but just kind of being like, great, those two students really were paying attention. One of them using the geometric model itself, and one of them using a table to solidify notation. And then also to generate different and interesting ways of describing the story context. I want to come back just one moment to share that in both of these situations, and I love that someone said, I noticed we started with 1 and not 0. And I'm going to say that in the scenario that we are seeing, the particular student kind of went back to 0 to make sense of. And I didn't share with you guys the way the students were thinking about this, but I also really, really appreciated that when we were talking about this student work, that we were honing in on what was appropriate toward the goals and not honing in on what was not correct. Like if we go in the future and we go down towards the takeaways, and we talk about this, when we talk about the domain of this down the road, it actually does start with day 1 and not day 0. However, using this student work to amplify student voice, to highlight their strengths, and to show that recursive equation of the P+2 is really a great way of talking about how am I using student voice and student thinking to talk about describing the story context. By the way, I've also had students say, well, if he did 3 on day 1, then he did 1 on day 0. And like, that's a whole nother conversation, right? But what we want to highlight in this segment of using student language is that we really want to change our language as teachers. It's the most immediate and impactful change we can make in disrupting deficit-based narratives. So instead of focusing or commenting on what maybe is not accurate or not 100% accurate, we are instead shifting our focus to what is right about student thinking. And as a result, we respond to work with a student on their strength and lead with curiosity. I can't tell you guys the number of times I've gone and I'm looking at a student's piece of work and I am assuming what they've done. And so then I already have this question in my mind that's redirecting them to the way I think. And it's a real shift to go to a student, lead with curiosity, and really being open to their perspective and their solution strategies, and then being able to follow up with those questions. We also, I am hoping that you've heard this. We really want to avoid using high, like my gifted students or my high students or my low students. That instead we want to think about all our students as being capable and able to do high levels of mathematics. And then also, I really like this 4th bullet, which is talking about how we want students to use their language. So pair students in formal language with the formal terminology rather than replacing their language. So when they talk about that P+2, like as they see that that is the repeated reasoning, that's not the explicit equation, but how great it is to talk about when you see from one term to the next, that we would talk about how that's recursive and put that space in there. And then we also want to talk about actions related to asset-based language. So commit to actions that we can do in our classroom is increase our awareness of language we use and refocus that language on students' assets and how they can build on them. We can create a school or system community of asset-based language by providing examples of reframing language and committing to one another to call out deficit framing when we hear it. So thinking about kind ways, but also helping others when they say something about low students. It's like, what are the unintended messages we have, whether students are in front of us or not, if we were to say something about low students? So how can we reframe our language and support one another? And then also, how do we include families and communities by inviting them to participate in activities that model and highlight attending to students' strengths? I am going to put into the chat box in just a moment a toolkit, if you will, of how you can include families in talking about how do they recognize, as well as we recognize, strengths within our students, and using that work that is there. I'd love for anyone to put any other additional ahas or information that you'd like into the chat box as we transition from looking at our asset-based language to asset-based routines. And Mike, would you like me to continue sharing the screen, or would you like to do that?
It'd be great if you could keep sharing the screen. That'd be lovely. And we'll give people just a moment or two here to type comments, questions related to asset-based language before we shift to asset-based routines and zoom out a little bit. So I'll give a little bit of good Zoom wait time here. Shanna, that's a really nice observation. If you're not looking directly at the chat, Shanna writes, I have students who still count on their fingers, but they count differently than we normally would and still get the correct answer. I've asked them to tell me what they're doing, and it's interesting to me. Yeah, I'm every time I give students a chance to really unpack their thinking, I'm almost always surprised because not exactly how I've thought about that thinking. I'll give just a moment more for people to put any additional ideas. All right. Well, with that, why don't we move to thinking about asset-based routines? And what we mean by asset-based routines are the routines, the practices, the recurring pieces of pedagogy that we use in our classroom that can be more asset-focused, that can bring forward that asset-based language that Jolie was talking about. So how do we think about those routines? We're going to use Scott's workout again to talk about this set of ideas. So why don't we move to the next slide, please? So I wanted to frame this in thinking about two overarching ideas: student choice and student voice. And this can be really challenging. We know when we open up our classrooms to allow students the opportunities to share their thinking, to really be driven by student discourse, that sometimes it can feel like a little bit of a free-for-all. Like, how do we think about students will say the darndest things, sometimes about the mathematics, sometimes about different mathematics than where we want to go, sometimes about different things entirely. So we want to think about these ideas of student choice and student voice. And at the same time that we're thinking about them, we want routines that kind of keep lessons moving in the direction that we're hoping to. We have mathematical goals that we need to achieve, and things we need to do. So it's really balancing those ideas. So with student choice, we're thinking in particular in this context about being able to select representations that make sense to them. And I appreciate the discussion we've already had about that in the chat. And then thinking about how to build their understanding by sharing those ideas and strategies and listening to and in theory adding to and contributing to the ideas of their peers. And that brings us into that student voice idea, that we position them to be knowers and doers of mathematics, to be authors, see themselves as authors of mathematics, and that their reasoning and sense making is important, not just my reasoning and sense making as the teacher. And thinking about how we use asset-based instructional routines that do that work, with individual students, with partners, with small group discourse, with whole group discourse. And how do we build those ideas kind of in putting bows on lessons and in helping us kind of have everybody take away a robust understanding of the mathematics, that we're trying to teach in class. And I think this is a constant tension when we have a lot of different solution strategies and we have a lot of different student thinking out there. We don't want the message that students take away is, oh, there's 5 different ways to do this thing, right? We want them to understand something about the mathematical thing that we're talking about. So it's important to have them understand that there's a variety of different routes that they can get to that, but also what is the important mathematics. So it's in that spirit that let's move on to the next slide here, and come back to Scott's workout. Here's what I want you to do. That this is exactly the same task that you had earlier. I won't make you waterfall this because I'm actually far too slow to read that deluge of text that goes in, but I want you to take the next 2 minutes and 18 seconds to just jot down a couple of ideas about if you were teaching this task at whatever grade level you want to think about, what would you do at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the lesson? And if you only want to think about like beginning, that's great. If you want to type if you want to jump right, type ideas about middle or end, go ahead and type those ideas in the chat. I'm going to be quiet for a little while to let you do that. I'd provide you with some hold music here, some thinking music, but you probably wouldn't appreciate my singing. So just go ahead and drop what you would do at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the task, just as Jolie's giving you that prompt. By the way, if you ever need a good strategy for not talking too much in your class, because I have this tendency to do that, get yourself a water bottle and something to drink, because if you're doing that, you're not talking in that moment. Okay, take another 38 seconds to write down your ideas. Hit enter in the chat as soon as you're ready. I'd love to see what you're thinking about. How would you start this lesson? What would you imagine going on in the middle of this lesson? What would happen at the end of this lesson? What would you do? So I see some interesting pieces here already. So Jamie's talking about reviewing or recapping the ways that the data, the sequence could be represented. Lovely. Like that feels like it's a big piece that we'd want to happen at the end. Christina talks about at the end of the task, comparing initial noticing and wondering to the patterns that were discovered in the middle. Can we answer some of those initial wonderings? So that also suggests something you would do at the beginning, which is some initial noticing and wonderings like we did. So a warm up to introduce the sequences, have students describe, Emily says, what's happening between each of the images, then have them draw some of the next ones, the 10th, the 20th, to see, at what point can we continue that without drawing out every sequence or even filling out a table row by row. I love that, really pushing towards that idea of generalization. Shanna says at the beginning, have them look at the visual representation to determine the pattern. In the middle, and have students creating questions they can answer and discuss what it looks like. And at the end, she would take it further, have them continue the pattern, talk about why patterns are important. What do they help us to do? Right? These are all fabulous ideas. And let me get one more in here that just dropped in. So Ruth talking about the beginning, how would you keep track? Well, I love that, right? So be able to think about, other than just Scott writing down on, on a whiteboard next to his workout area, how would you keep track of it? Have them show one way and then have them come up with another way at the end. Fabulous. Why don't we advance to the next slide, please? So one of the things that we want to talk about is generally when we do these tasks that are high cognitive demand tasks that have multiple approaches to them, that have that low floor, like everybody can get started on Scott's workout task, if nothing else, by counting the number of squares in that representation, right? Some students may jump to starting to work on a generalization. And there's a variety of things people can do in between. But generally, when I think about how to structure a lesson, I'm thinking about a launch. What are we going to do collectively to get that work started? What are we going to do in an exploratory phase? I'm going to give students the agency, the opportunity to do that work, to generate those representations, to do that thinking. And I'm going to be walking around monitoring that in small groups to really listen to what they're talking about, as we've said. And then I've got to pull everybody back together to discuss it, right? We can't just leave it that the small groups do work and they, but I want to pull that back together. And as Jolie just showed you, this maps on pretty nicely to an asset-based routine that we call the 5 practices for orchestrating productive mathematics discussions. Can I get people to just give me a wave or a thumbs up or something in the chat to let me know, how are you familiar with this model? Have you seen the 5 practices before? I see some no's. Great. Oh, fabulous. Awesome. Well, in that case, if everybody's saying yes, I would say, well, let's just move on. The 5 practices really structures when I'm going into a school and working with a class and teaching students using these high cognitive demand tasks. Yes, Carrie, there's actually a volume about using the 5 practices in science as well. So I've got something specifically that you can use also. And it's the same 5 practices, except there's actually 6 because we realized when we came forward with this model that there was something kind of implicit to start with, and that's setting the goals for learning and selecting a good high cognitive demand task that really addresses those sorts of ideas. And so this all evolves, the 5 practices work all evolves from work with teachers that we saw using these rich tasks and being able to and engaging in these predictable routines that really were asset focused. So setting a goal, selecting a task that's got multiple entry points. It's got multiple representations that can be used, and multiple pathways through the task. Don't sleep on practice one, which is anticipating student thinking. I used to kind of pop open my book, like, okay, here's what the next lesson is. You take a glance at it, for maybe a couple of minutes, say, okay, I think I know what's going on here. This was a terrible practice on my part, because I would then constantly be ambushed by interesting student thinking that would arise in my classroom that then I would have to make sense of in the moment, and then figure out, is this useful? Is it right? Is it useful? What do I do with this? So by anticipating the ways that students might work on the task, that move through the task in advance as a part of our planning process, it really takes the cognitive load off of us as teachers. If I've thought about the 6 ways that I expect students to be making sense of the problem, then as I'm walking around and doing the monitoring, there's practice 2 that you see in there, and looking and listening to what students are doing, I'm mentally saying, oh, that's like solution 2 that I came up with. Oh, wait, this is like solution 4. Oh, wait, this one is actually new. And I can pause for a minute to make sense of it because I've done a lot of that work in advance of thinking through those student solutions. And so that's really, that monitoring takes place as a part of the explore phase of that lesson. And then bringing everybody together and thinking about that whole group discussion. That's where practices 3, 4, and 5. And you see Jolie has mapped those onto our teaching cycle nicely for us, selecting what solutions we want to bring forward, sequencing them in a way that makes sense, that builds the mathematical ideas in a sensible way that really leads to our goals. And then connecting those solutions and connecting that student thinking, asking good questions that do that work. So we're going to come back to actually that student work that you saw before. We're going to add in some extra pieces as we go through. And I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of this. I haven't asked you to anticipate student thinking, although you've thought a little bit about the task already. So I want to flag that this is a completely artificial and way too quick version of this that we're going to ask you to do. But we're going to put up a couple of slides of student work. And for everyone, I want you to think about, what do you notice about the student work that you might use or that you might not use in a whole class discussion. So if we're thinking about picking a few pieces of student work, we're going to put them up, we're going to display them, we're going to have kids talk about them. Like, which ones would you choose? So let's start moving through those slides and put that student work up. And what I'd love you to type in the chat is, like, what would you use from what you see, and why would you choose that one to use? So this we've seen before. Would you use this? If you would, what would you want to come out of that piece? Go ahead and take a few moments to type in the chat. Let me take a drink from my water bottle again so I stop talking. While you're typing and thinking, Julie's putting some great information about the 5 practices in the chat. Lenina, yes, there is a resource for the 5 practices. And I'll tell you what, I am happy to gather those and put those in the chat when I hand back off to Jolie in a few slides. And I agree with what Jolie said. Before I started using the 5 practices, I just do that thing that we do as teachers where we're like, who's got an answer that they'd like to share? And oftentimes that first answer would be pretty polished and often really complex. And like, oftentimes that really took away the agency of some of the other students in the class to be able to say, I'm still trying to make sense of what this student said. Well, I'm certainly not going to share mine now. And and maybe you even lost me. I'm like, that's not at all like what I had here. So I'm just tuned out. So Grace talks about, in terms of sequencing, would show the drawing before the table. Yeah, and I think I'd probably be asking some questions, like if I had both of those representations up there, about where do you see the +2 that's in the table in the drawing when we added that table representation in. That starts to get us at kind of connecting those solutions. Let's show you a set of student work that you haven't seen yet. I want you to keep what you've got, what you have on that previous slide in mind, and take a look here. How would you connect one or more of these representations to what came before that table and that recursive +2? Put a few ideas in there in the chat, please. So I see some great ideas in the chat. So Shanna asking are there different representations of the same thing? And noting, yes, all students learn differently. So again, this is a great reason to afford that access to these multiple representations. You never know which one students are going to connect to. How do they think the block relates to the graph in the center there? Like, that's a great question. What do you think your classmates thought of the graph? Yeah, absolutely. So opportunities for them to kind of reconnect with each other. What's similar, what's different? What does this help you see? Like, if I would love to ask about the graph. Where do you see the +2 happening in that sketch of the graph? Christina, I like the color representation in this one even more. Like, you can see not just how it's building from one stage to the next, but you can see what built each time. Yeah, what do they notice about the colored one? Yeah, these are fabulous questions. I want to share with you a couple of more pieces of student work, and I won't ask you to necessarily do this again, but we thought this student work is really interesting because as you think about the generalization of this, right? Scott starts with 3 and he adds 2 each day. So you want to see that constant 3, you want to see that +2. And you see in this student's piece of work, like, you see these vertical lines that indicate the 3, and then they've circled that set of 3. And then you see the +2, and you see these sequences of these vertical +2s up there. And you see actually what turns out to be kind of the start of that generalization at the top, like noticing that there's this constant +3, and noticing that there are that the added +2s, there are, if we've got 4 of those, there's 3 of those +2s that are happening. So you've got this idea of n-1 coming in, and we want, yeah, we want 2 of those each time. So I see some really interesting stuff in here, and I think if we go to that next slide, you'll see kind of the next iteration of this student's work. Julie's doing the hard work here, both typing in the chat and keeping the slides moving. So big appreciation for her doing that. So you see the work has evolved here. You see the 2 times the quantity n-1 there that gets us towards that generalization. You see us, the number 10 up there, noting that for step 10, like, there would be 9 of those +2s that get added. and thinking about some questions I might ask the student, like, I like how you make your thinking visible. Can you share with me how you see the pattern growing? That's really like not assuming we know what students are thinking. And then how did they arrive at their answer for number one? Like how many push-ups will Scott do on day 10? That's a great way to do that. And one of the reasons we wanted to share this is like a colleague of Jolie's and mine that brought the student work forward. This work actually comes from one of their special education students. And a lot of times, I think we worry, are all students going to have access to a task? And these tasks that have the low floor and the high ceiling, when we really use those routines that allow students to engage in that thinking, that provide them with those opportunities to think and to work their way through the mathematics, all of our students surprise us. But I've found particularly with our special ed students, with our students who have had a history of struggling in mathematics, these tasks really allow them to shine in important ways. So let's just talk about a couple of other things here. Julie, why don't we move to 22 if we could, please? So let me just zoom out here. We're thinking about asset-based routines, and the 5 practices is certainly an example. But other routines that you can use in the classroom that do this sort of work, like thinking about think, pair, share during the explore phase of a task, and giving students opportunities to do some of that individual thinking on their own, and then to really bring that to a pair and then to a small group. Doing a turn and talk. I think somebody had said in the chat, maybe having that happen even during the whole class discussion. I love doing that. Like if I ask a question in the whole class discussion that tries to bring those ideas together and it falls flat, like my default move next is say, turn and talk with your partner for 2 minutes and get some discourse going. Those are good routines because then they've got something to feed back to me that comes from their thinking. A lot of times when we ask that question in that pivotal moment that falls flat, the temptation is to just say the math that we wanted to hear. And this really prevents us from doing that. And then thinking about routines like compare and connect, and thinking about discussions supports like sentence frames. Kids don't automatically know how to talk about mathematics. So when we can do things like sentence frames that get them started on, oh, okay, this is how I would start a sentence about this, that's really super helpful. So if we can move on to kind of thinking about what might you do related to asset-based routines, is to identify these sorts of routines that provide those meaningful opportunities for student work, for student talk, and for their thinking to drive the lesson. I want to really encourage you to shift your planning process. My planning used to be, let me make sure I've written down all the steps for the 3 examples I want to show during my lecture. You can't do that with these sorts of tasks. If we do that, we take all the challenge away. We take the agency away from our students. So really shifting that planning process from writing down the math that I was going to say to being able to anticipate how students are going to think about those ideas and orchestrating those discussions. And it's those rich, high cognitive demand tasks that provide multiple student entry points. Now, like I said, this doesn't happen on its own. And let's move to the next slide. And then after this one, I'm going to toss it back to Jolie for our last little piece here. I'm not going to read this word for word for you, but getting students to really focus on their mathematical assets, getting them to bring that forward doesn't happen in a vacuum. We have to think about what are the aspects of agency, of authority, of students' identities as mathematics knowers and doers that really set the stage, set the right conditions for that to happen. So with that in mind, you want to think about how are we empowering students? How are we elevating that agency? And that brings us to a really nice connection to social emotional learning. And I'll toss back to Jolie to finish us up on that.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. I almost did the lovely thing that we probably have all done at one point in time, which is I almost started talking without unmuting myself. Oh, Shanna, that's a great, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, if it's Shanna or Shauna, but I love your connection to number talks because that's another beautiful routine and example of of being able to really talk about and focus on student thinking. And number talks, the 5 practices, I put in some resources that Mike, I know, said he's going to go grab, is like, so the 5 practices resources, the open up tasks all align to the 5 practices. So if you're ever looking for a task, or if you wanted to, if you teach high school math, all of the high school math tasks align to the 5 practices if you're interested in looking at that. Also, Mike beautifully talked about the math language routines and thinking about things like compare and connect, collect and display, using sentence stems. One of the great things I want to add just for a moment is that when students are sharing, and I can't remember who, but lots of great questions that you guys put in the chat box that we could ask students. But one of them is like, how could you compare one student strategy to another? Actually naming the strategy based on the student who first shared it, even over days, is a great way of having students recognize that it's our peers and it's ourselves that are coming up with these strategies and ideas about the mathematics that make them also realize that they are mathematicians themselves. And so as a class, when they are saying, oh, Josh's strategy for showing Scott's workout in a graph or an equation or a table is something that, like doing the constant difference or whatever that happens to be. Anyway, so I want to share with you, there is the Castle 5, and just like Mike did in the chat box with your level of familiarity with the 5 practices, will you just put on a scale of 1 to 3, 1 being I've never heard of SEL, 2, I'm somewhat familiar with the Castle framework. Sorry, this is all about the Castle framework, not just SEL, but just the Castle framework itself. 1 is I've not heard of it. 3 is I use it conscientiously daily. And thank you. And I'm seeing some 1s and 2s and really appreciate you guys kind of just sharing what that is. We'll also add the Castle framework into the chat box as far as resources, but and you can also Google Castle. We're focusing specifically on social awareness and relationship skills today. And one of the things is when our group is talking about how do we connect social emotional learning to the work that we are doing, I want us to think about these 2 things. One is when it comes to relationship skills, what the Castle framework says is how do we establish and maintain healthy and supportive relationships and to effectively navigate settings with diverse individuals and groups. That's like thinking about how do we support students in developing relationships. Well, one of the things that we do, as Mike mentioned during that explore phase, as we're walking around monitoring as teachers, we are encouraging our students to first think independently about a problem, but then to share strategies with partners. And so thinking about how does that increase relationship skills and respect for one another. And then also, as he mentioned in the discuss phase, we have selected and sequenced students, and now we are having them share their strategies and also making connections. So thinking about that. In addition to relationship, we also want to think about social awareness. Like sometimes I actually was a student who was always super eager to share and didn't realize that my oversharing or eagerness to share maybe did not position others as powerful mathematical thinkers, or it made it so that everybody was thinking the way I was thinking, as opposed to me becoming stronger. So in other words, I've developed the social awareness actually more as an adult of, holding back and making sure that I understand the perspective of others. And I understand, different people come with different experiences and being able to share different ways of thinking. So those 2 areas, I want us to think about these. And in the chat box right now, and yes, Mike, thank you for mentioning that super cool interactive wheel. I am going to, Mike just put in the Castle framework. I am also putting in a document, which is kind of coming towards the end of our session, that gives more information about relationship skills and social awareness. I just realized Mike and I can also on the same document put in the resources that we have mentioned and or have also put in chat box throughout this session. But when we go over, and I'm sharing my screen, so when you click on that link now, the question is, how does asset-based language and routines that we've shared today support students' development of relationship skills and social awareness? And as you clicked on the link, and I love so many people are in here. We have about 9 people in here so far. Oh, it just took my internet a moment to catch up. We have some more people, but as you come in, please go ahead and kind of see some more details about social awareness and self-awareness and relationship skills. And I didn't mean to zoom through that so quickly, but at the bottom, it asks the question, how does asset-based language and routines support students' development of relationship skills and social awareness? It is the place where we wanted to come back, and we also are so grateful that you are here today. We appreciate you so much. And also, we'd love if you have a moment to just share, instead of in the chat box, answering the question that is here at the bottom, and or putting something that you got from today that you hope to implement in your class. Mike, any last words and before we say thank you so much?
I echo that thank you so much. And I think we've got a few minutes left in the session for some Q&A. We'd be happy for people to drop questions in the chat, unmute your mics. Happy to chat a little bit in the last waiting moments.
Yes, Mike, can you tell us, is our time at 12:25?
That's correct. That's correct.
I mean, 11:25. Okay, great. Wonderful. Yeah, so coming to this castle, and by the way, I was actually on the inclusion team at the State Board of Education when Mike was sharing all the stuff that I've done over 30 years, which I apologize that Mike, that you had to read all of that. But I am very much about supporting all students in having access and success with grade level content. So I really appreciate the person who put equitable inclusion here. With the time that we have, I think it would also be great if anyone, Mike, is it true that people can come off mute and share things out loud?
That's correct. Yeah, everybody can go off mute, and they can always speak whatever questions they have.
Great. Mike and I will also put our email addresses in the chat box, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other a little bit better. And if anyone would like to come off mute, share anything, and or put something in the chat box. And I'm going to put in my easy email address to remember, which is just my name at gmail.com.
I like this idea in the chat that we keep coming back to about people learning differently. And I think that's really important. I think often as teachers, we are biased to think about how people learn as the way that we learn. And the more that we can focus on student assets and bringing those forward, it helps us really attend to the wide variety of ways that people learn.
And Mike, thank you so much for moderating and introducing us today. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks so much, everyone. We hope you have a great rest of your conference.
Thank you everyone for coming for session 2. I appreciate if you can put your attendance and evaluation. Attendance are required if you want to get CPE or CU units for this session. I appreciate your coming, and I hope you enjoy the discussion here. Thank you, Jolie, and thank you, Mike, for coming over to our sessions. In behalf of Nevada, I'd like to thank everybody. Bye for now.